vast, beautiful, merciless. Alaska's wilderness is a place of legends, but some tales aren't folklore. They're nightmares that began with a misplaced step, a vanished radio signal, or a winter night you'll never forget. In this video, we uncover 5 of the most disturbing horror stories to come out of Alaska, from isolated cabins and frozen roads to things that refuse to be explained. Turn down the lights, turn up the volume, and brace yourself. Because once you hear these, the silence outside your window will feel different. Subscribe for more dark tales. If you survive these 5 tales, hit like all and share the nightmare. Also comment from where you are listening. Now, let's begin. The Mackenzie Basin Migration Study. It seemed like the perfect assignment. My big break. After 7 years of smaller research projects, I was finally getting to lead a team. We were studying how climate change was affecting traditional migration routes near the Mackenzie River. The approval came in early June 2019. Within 2 weeks, I was flying into the Canadian wilderness with a 5-person research team. Our job was to monitor 47 GPS-collared caribou over 4 weeks. We had to document their movements and their behavior. The data we were gathering could influence conservation policy for the whole region. This was without a doubt the most important project of my career. I remember that feeling as we loaded the gear, a mix of pure excitement and crushing responsibility. We had thermal drones tracking arrays and enough camping supplies for an extended stay in seriously remote territory. We set up our base camp at an old logging site. It had been abandoned sometime in the 1980s. The spot was perfect for our research. It had flat ground for the equipment. It was close to the river for water, and it was positioned right on a main caribou corridor. But the place had an atmosphere, an unsettling feeling I just couldn't shake. Rusted-out machinery sat half-buried under moss. Rotting wooden structures were slowly being swallowed by the forest. My team consisted of Dr. Ben Carter, our seasoned project leader, Kira Sharma, from the university's tech department, and 2 graduate students named Leo and Maya. We'd all worked together before, so we fell into a rhythm. We set up the camp, we split the daily duties, and we started our research. The first few days went exactly as planned. We had clear, consistent GPS signals streaming in from all 47 animals. The work was methodical. It was rewarding. Every morning, we'd check the tracking systems, drinking coffee around the portable stove, watching all the red dots move across our digital maps. The caribou were following their expected routes. They clustered in feeding areas by day and pushed steadily north by night. Kira, she handled the thermal drone flights, capturing footage to go with our GPS data. Leo and Maya, they took shifts, monitoring the radio frequencies. Dr. Carter and I, we analyzed the movement patterns and updated our field notes. The weather was perfect. Cool mornings, warm afternoons, and crystal clear nights. Ideal for the equipment. By day 5, we had already documented some fascinating changes from the historical migration paths. This was exactly the kind of data that would make our research matter. The routine was comfortable. It was predictable. Everything was going according to plan. But during those first few days, I started noticing small things, details about the abandoned logging site that I hadn't seen at first. There were these perfectly straight-cut marks on some of the trees, far too precise to be natural. It suggested the loggers had used some kind of advanced equipment way ahead of its time. The concrete foundations of the old buildings they formed, geometric patterns that seemed almost deliberate, like the original layout had a specific organizational system. And the strangest part, we found several metal plates buried under the debris. Each one was stamped with sequential numbers, but no company name, no dates, nothing. Dr. Carter even mentioned that logging operations from that era usually left obvious traces. Marked trees, serial numbers on equipment, proper signage. This place was different. It was almost sterile, as if it had been intentionally wiped clean of all identifying information. Still, it wasn't our job to investigate the site's past. We had work to do. Everything changed on the night of June 12th. I was in my tent reviewing data logs. It was around 11:03 p.m. Suddenly, Leo came running from the monitoring station, his face completely pale in the lantern light. "Eris, you need to see this. Right now," he said. His voice was tight with panic. All 47 GPS signals had disappeared simultaneously at exactly 11,117 p.m. Not one by one, not a few at a time, all of them at once, like someone had just flipped a switch. The tracking system showed no errors, no malfunctions. There was no technical explanation for a total blackout. Kira ran diagnostics on our receivers. Dr. Carter checked the backup systems. Everything on our end was working perfectly. We spent the next 3 hours just scrambling, trying to get a signal, adjusting frequencies, boosting the power, even trying to manually ping individual callers. Nothing. The caribou had simply vanished from our network. We were left staring at blank screens, wondering what in the hell had just happened. The silence that came after was wrong. The Canadian wilderness at night is never silent. You hear owls, branches creaking, small animals in the undergrowth. But after the signals vanished, even those familiar sounds just faded away. It was replaced by this oppressive quiet that made my ears ring. We decided to take shifts monitoring the equipment all night, just hoping the signals would come back. Dr. Carter took the first watch, then Kira, then Leo. My turn came at 4 a.m. I sat alone in the monitoring tent, surrounded by dead equipment, just trying to make sense of it. The GPS system had never failed like this before, and the timing, all signals cutting out at the exact same second, it suggested something much worse than a technical glitch. I just kept checking the logs over and over, looking for some pattern we had missed. Dawn brought no relief, just more questions. We packed up our gear and headed out to the last known location of the nearest herd. It was about 7 miles northeast of our camp. The hike was tense. We walked through the dense forest, just lost in our own thoughts about what we were going to find. When we got to the area, there was nothing. No sign of the animals, no tracks, no droppings, no evidence they had ever been there. But our field equipment was completely undisturbed. It was all sitting exactly where we had left it. The cameras, the motion sensors, even the backup GPS units were all functioning, still recording data. It was as if the caribou had just evaporated. They left behind only the technology we were using to watch them. Kira suggested we expand the search radius, but Dr. Carter was already looking worried. We spent the entire day searching a 12-mile area. We found nothing but empty wilderness and the growing certainty that something impossible had happened. That evening, Kira decided to review the thermal drone footage from the night before. She was hoping for any clue. We all gathered around her laptop in the main tent, watching hours of grainy infrared video. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect: empty forest, the occasional rabbit or fox, the normal thermal signatures of a quiet night. But at 11:15 p.m., just 2 minutes before the GPS signals died, the footage captured something impossible. 8 tall figures emerged from the tree line. They moved in perfect synchronization across the open area near our camp. They were humanoid, but wrong. Too tall, too coordinated. They moved with a fluid precision that looked almost mechanical. The thermal imaging showed they were warmer than the forest, but cooler than a normal human body. The most disturbing part was how they moved together. Like a single organism with multiple bodies, they kept the exact same spacing and mirrored each other's movements as they crossed the frame and disappeared back into the trees. None of us said a word for several minutes. Dr. Carter. He rewound it 3-4 times, just studying every detail. Leo kept muttering that the equipment had to be malfunctioning, but Kira and I, we knew what we were seeing was real. The thermal image was too clear, too detailed. It wasn't a glitch. The figures looked to be at least 9 feet tall. They had elongated limbs, and they moved like they knew the terrain perfectly. They made no sound that the drone's microphones could pick up. They moved over fallen logs and through dense brush without disturbing a single branch. But what haunted me was the coordination, not just walking information. They were mirroring each other, down to the smallest gesture. When the lead figure raised what looked like an arm, all 8 performed the identical motion at the exact same time. We watched that clip dozens of times. It only raised more questions. What were we dealing with, and what did it have to do with the caribou? That night, we started a buddy system. No one was allowed to leave their tent alone. We set up hourly check-ins until dawn, but I barely slept. I just listened to every sound outside, wondering if those figures were still out there, watching us. Around 3 a.m., I heard Maya whisper to Leo in the tent next to mine. I called out. I asked if everything was okay. She just said she'd had a bad dream. The rest of the night was quiet. But the morning brought a new kind of horror, one that made the day before seem trivial. When we gathered for coffee at 7 a.m., Leo was missing. His sleeping bag was empty. His personal gear was still neatly arranged right by his cot, but his boots were gone. We searched the camp calling his name, checking everywhere he might have gone. Dr. Carter was already talking about hitting the satellite phone to call for help when I decided to check the riverbank. I thought maybe he'd gone for water and slipped. But what I found at the water's edge, it defied all logic. Leo's hiking boots were placed with mathematical precision on a flat rock. They were positioned perfectly parallel to each other, and they were facing directly toward the river. The laces were tied in neat bows, just like he always wore them, and there wasn't a single speck of mud or a scuff mark on them. But there were no footprints. Nothing. Not leading to the boots, not leading away from them. Nothing in the soft, muddy soil to show how they got there. The rock they were sitting on was completely dry, even though the morning mist had soaked everything else around it. I called the others over. We spent 2 hours examining every single inch of the ground, looking for any trace of Leo. The absence of tracks was absolute. It was impossible. Even if someone had tried to erase the footprints, there would be signs of the erasure itself. But the boots, they just sat there, like a carefully arranged display, as if they'd been placed by something that could move without ever touching the ground. We packed up the camp immediately. We hiked back to the nearest communication point and we called the authorities. The search and rescue operation lasted for 4 days. They brought in helicopters tracking dogs and wilderness rescue teams. They found no trace of Leo. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead. The working theory was that he'd fallen into the river and been swept away. But that explanation, it never accounted for the boots. The investigators, they just dismissed them, called them irrelevant details. 8 months later, I got a call. It was from a forestry worker who was doing surveys in that same area. He'd found something buried under a pile of rocks near the old logging site. It was a GPS collar. It was still functional, and its data showed it had been stationary in that exact location since June 12th at 11:17 p.m. It was one of the collars from our caribou. The timing matched perfectly with the moment all the signals disappeared. I never went back to that site. And I've never worked another research project in that region. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. It was September 28th, 2021. The autumn wind sweeping across Covenant Cove's West Beach carried the smell of salt and the sharp bite of approaching winter. This was the day that Elena Malik decided to vanish. Elena, a 36-year-old indigenous Alaskan woman, had been surviving in a threadbare canvas tent for almost 3 weeks. She was part of a swelling community of displaced people, a tent city born from Alaska's unforgiving economic reality. Elena had journeyed to Covenant Cove from her tiny remote village of Utqiagvik Point, a community of less than 150 people. She was searching for 2 things: better opportunities and medical treatment for a chronic condition. Instead, she collided with a severe housing crisis. She was left camping on the exposed, windswept beach, waiting for help from social services that were completely overwhelmed. Elena's story sadly is not unique. It reflects the struggle of many indigenous Alaskans who leave their ancestral villages for larger towns, hoping for jobs, education, or healthcare. Utqiagvik Point, perched on the far western edge of the state just 55 miles from the Siberian coast, had little to offer. Life there was about subsistence hunting and fishing. The village had no running water, unreliable electricity, and a clinic that could only handle basic first aid. Anything serious required an expensive flight to Covenant Cove or even Anchorage. Back home, Elena had been a village health aide, a vital link to medical care for her community. But a childhood injury had left her with chronic back pain that needed specialized treatment she just couldn't get in Utqiagvik Point. The tent city on West Beach grew all through the summer of 2021 as the state's housing shortage hit a breaking point. Covenant Cove, with its small population of around 3,600, couldn't house its own residents, let alone the newcomers. The beach camp was in a legal limbo, technically public land, but seen as a growing safety hazard by the city. Elena's tent was one of about 9, a small cluster of people trying to look out for one another, all while drowning in the bureaucracy of assistance programs. People who knew Elena described her as quiet and thoughtful, a woman who held on to her dignity despite her dire circumstances. She was fluent in both her native language and English, and she often acted as a translator and an advocate for other indigenous people in the camp who found the system impossible to navigate. Her tent was neat and organized. Inside, she kept a few cherished items: family photos, supplies for traditional beadwork, and the vital medication she needed for her pain. She was actively working with a local social services coordinator to find a real apartment, but the waiting list was months, if not years long. On the cold evening of September 27th, the day before she vanished, other camp residents remembered Elena seeming different. She was more anxious than usual, pacing back and forth near her tent. They saw her making several trips to a payphone at a gas station nearby. She told someone she was waiting for a critical phone call, something about a housing opportunity. She seemed both hopeful and doubtful that it would actually happen. Her neighbors also noticed she had packed her few belongings into a single backpack, but she hadn't said anything about leaving. Later that night, she shared coffee around a small campfire with her neighbors, speaking in her native tongue about her grandmother's stories and voicing her fear of the coming winter. The morning of September 28th was gray, windy, and cold. The temperature was barely in the low 40s. Alaska's short autumn was over and winter was taking hold. Elena's neighbors saw her up early, just sitting outside her tent watching the sunrise over Kovac Sound and drinking instant coffee from a metal mug. Around 8 a.m., she spoke to Maria Cade, the woman in the tent closest to hers. Elena said she was going for a walk along the beach to clear her head and weigh her options. She was wearing her typical clothes: dark jeans, a heavy flannel shirt, a gray hooded sweatshirt, and a pair of worn-out black sneakers. Maria later told the police that Elena seemed different that morning. Not anxious like the night before, but focused and determined. The 2 women had bonded over their shared experiences, and Maria recognized the look of someone who had finally made a decision. Elena had been venting her frustration about the endless paperwork for housing and the constant dead ends. She was especially terrified of the winter, knowing the beach camp would soon be impossible to survive. When Elena didn't come back by the afternoon, Maria wasn't immediately worried. She figured Elena had found a warm place to spend the day or was finally filling out paperwork at a social services office. But as the sun went down and the temperature plummeted, real concern set in. The other residents started searching the area. They found Elena's tent completely untouched. Her sleeping bag was still inside. So were her medications and her identification. But the most chilling discovery was her heavy winter coat. It was still in the tent despite the freezing weather. Nobody planning to be outside for long would have left that coat behind. The next morning, Maria Cade contacted the Covenant Cove Police Department and reported her friend missing. Officer Ben Carter himself, an indigenous Alaskan who understood the local community, took the report. He interviewed the other camp residents and started a methodical search of the town's few roads and the long stretches of beach. The initial search checked all the places Elena might have gone to escape the cold abandoned buildings, storage units, and the areas around the harbor. On the second day, Alaska State Troopers joined the effort, bringing in more people and specialized wilderness search equipment. Sergeant Mark Hess, a trooper with deep experience in missing persons cases, coordinated with local tribal groups and elders who knew the land and its dangers. Search teams used ATVs to cover the roads, while volunteers walked the beaches and tidal zones looking for any sign of the missing woman. Then, on October 3rd, nearly a week after she disappeared, a discovery was made that would haunt the investigation. A volunteer search party walking the beach about 2 miles west of the camp found Elena's belongings. Her black sneakers, her socks, and her gray hooded sweatshirt were all neatly arranged on the sand just above the high tide line. The items looked placed. They weren't scattered by the wind or washed ashore. There was no sign of a struggle. But the most baffling part was the condition of the clothes. They showed no sign of having been out in the harsh weather for a week. This discovery created far more questions than answers. The sneakers were set side by side as if someone had taken them off carefully before walking into the water. The socks were tucked inside them, and the sweatshirt was folded nearby. Extensive searches of the water and the surrounding shoreline found no other trace of Elena. The site was processed for any forensic evidence, but nothing could explain what happened. Elena's disappearance immediately brought up the agonizing context of missing and murdered indigenous women and people. Alaska has one of the highest rates of missing indigenous persons in the entire country, and too often, these cases do not get the resources or the attention they deserve. Elena's case became a flashpoint. It fueled a growing movement led by Native activists demanding better investigations and real prevention efforts. They argued that systemic issues and cultural biases were contributing to the staggering number of unresolved cases in their communities. The official search for Elena continued for weeks. Helicopters scanned from the airboats with sonar, patrolled the sound, and ground teams covered hundreds of square miles. The Alaska Bureau of Investigation even brought in ground-penetrating radar to check areas where she might have been. But despite all these efforts, nothing more was ever found. Elena's family traveled from Utqiagvik Point to Covenant Cove to join the search. Her sister Lena Malik spoke to the media. She pleaded for better support services for indigenous people facing homelessness. She insisted that every missing person's case should be treated with urgency regardless of where they lived. The family held traditional ceremonies to honor Elena and to pray for her return, drawing attention to the cultural parts of the case that outside investigators might easily miss. The case eventually gained national attention when a popular podcaster, Jackson Pierce, featured Elena's disappearance in his series on missing persons in Alaska. His investigation highlighted the complex web of social and economic problems that had left Elena so vulnerable. The podcast also brought new scrutiny to the region's history of unexplained disappearances and the ongoing MMIW crisis. Today, Elena Malik's disappearance is still officially classified as an open missing persons case. State troopers continue to follow up on any new tips. Her tent on West Beach is long gone, but her personal belongings are still held in evidence in the faint hope that they might one day provide an answer for her family. Elena's story stands as a tragic and sobering reminder of the dangers faced by displaced Indigenous people and the desperate need for better systems to prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again. My name is Marcus Blackwater, and I've been operating ferry routes between Alaska's coastal towns for 17 years. I started right out of high school on my uncle's boat and learned every inlet and channel from Ketchikan to Dutch Harbor. I've seen storms that could flip a house, rescued stranded fishermen from ice floes, and carried everything from wedding parties to body bags across these dark waters. The Coast Guard calls me when they need someone who knows these waters like his own backyard. But what happened last month between Sitka and Juneau changed everything I thought I knew about what lies beneath these waves. I learned that some chilling legends aren't just stories, they're warnings. I run the Northern Passage, a 78-foot passenger ferry that seats 42 people. She's got twin diesel engines, satellite navigation, and enough safety equipment to handle anything the Gulf of Alaska throws at us. My route covers the smaller communities where the big ferries don't go, places like Angoon, Teneke Springs, and the logging camps on Utqiagvik Island. Most days, it's locals heading to Juneau for supplies or medical appointments, with the occasional tourist wanting the authentic Alaska experience. Growing up here, you hear the old stories. My grandmother was half-tilling it, and she told me about the Kushtaka when I was maybe 8 years old. Shapeshifters, she called them. Otter spirits that could look like people, lure you into the water, then drag you down and steal your soul. The elders say they can take the form of anyone who's drowned, using their memories to trick new victims. I always figured it was just folklore, something to keep kids away from dangerous water. Then bodies started showing up along my regular routes. The first one washed up near Hoonah in early September. The Coast Guard said it was probably a fishing accident. A guy went overboard, drowned, and got chewed up by the current. But I saw the body when they pulled it out. There were deep claw marks on his arms and chest, like something with webbed hands had grabbed him. His eyes were gone, the sockets clean, as if something had plucked them out, neat and careful. The medical examiner said his lungs were full of salt water, but mixed with blood, like he'd been bleeding internally while he drowned. 3 more bodies turned up over the next month, all along my route. Same pattern every time: claw marks, missing eyes, bloody seawater in their lungs. The victims were all people I'd carried on my ferry at some point. That should have been my first real warning, but I told myself it was just coincidence. Small communities, everyone uses the ferry eventually. October was brutal that year. Constant rain, rough seas, and fog so thick you couldn't see your own bow. I was running behind schedule on a Tuesday morning when I got a radio call from a hiker stranded on Baranof Island. She said her name was Sarah Chen. She'd been camping alone for 2 weeks and her boat had engine trouble. She was at the old logging camp dock and needed a pickup to Juneau for a medical appointment. I found her waiting on the dock in the rain, but something felt off immediately. She was wearing jeans and a light jacket. She should have been soaked through after standing in that downpour for who knows how long, but her clothes were completely dry. Not damp, not recently dried. Bone dry, like she'd been standing under cover the whole time. Sarah seemed normal enough when she came aboard. Asian woman. Maybe 35, friendly smile, and she paid cash for her ticket. She took a seat near the window and started chatting with the other passengers, an elderly couple from Sitka, a construction worker heading to Juneau, and Frank Morrison, an old-timer I'd been carrying for years. Frank was going to visit his wife's grave on her birthday, something he did every year since she died. But Sarah kept staring out at the water with this look on her face, not peaceful or thoughtful. It was hungry, like she was watching for something. And when she smiled at the other passengers, I noticed her teeth looked different, sharper than normal, more pointed. About an hour into the trip, Sarah started telling Frank about his wife, detailed stories about conversations they'd had and places they'd visited together. At first, Frank seemed pleased that someone was interested, but then his face went pale. Sarah was describing private moments, things Frank had never told anyone. She talked about arguments they'd had, secret fears his wife had shared with him, even what she'd whispered to him on her deathbed. "How do you know all that?" Frank asked, his voice shaking. Sarah just laughed. "I was there, listening from the water. Your wife told me everything while she was floating." That's when I noticed her skin under the cabin lights. It had this weird texture, like it was constantly wet even though she was dry. When she touched the armrest of her seat, she left behind a slimy handprint that didn't evaporate. The other passengers started acting strange. The elderly couple got up and walked to the railing, staring down at the waves like they were hypnotized. The construction worker followed them, all three of them leaning forward like they wanted to jump overboard. And Sarah was making these clicking sounds under her breath, like she was talking to something in the water around us. Frank suddenly stood up and climbed over the safety rail. "Mary's calling me," he said, tears streaming down his face. "She says the water will heal all my pain, that we can be together again." I grabbed Frank and pulled him back, but Sarah was right there, encouraging him to jump. "Go to her," she whispered. "The cold water will wash away all your sadness. She's waiting for you down there with all the others." That's when I saw Sarah's reflection in the cabin window. It wasn't human. The reflection showed a sleek, otter-like creature covered in dark fur, with mossy, abrasive claws and intelligent, predatory eyes. Its mouth was full of needle-sharp teeth, and its body moved with fluid grace, even while Sarah's human form stood perfectly still. Sarah noticed me staring at the window. Her human disguise started slipping, patches of wet fur appearing on her arms and face. Her fingers stretched into webbed claws, and her eyes went completely black. "You can see me," she said, but her voice had changed. It was Frank's wife now, speaking in Mary Morrison's exact tone. "I've been so lonely down there, Marcus. All those people you carry back and forth, they keep me company now. Would you like to see them?" Sarah grabbed Frank with her clawed hands and started dragging him toward the water. She moved impossibly fast, and her skin was so slippery I couldn't get a grip on her. Frank screamed as she pulled him overboard, but the sound cut off the instant they hit the freezing water. I threw life preservers and called Mayday, but when the Coast Guard arrived 30 minutes later, they found nothing. No trace of Frank or Sarah. The search team did recover Frank's eyes floating on the surface, perfectly preserved, but turned completely white, like cataracts had formed instantly. The official report said Frank Morrison fell overboard and drowned. No mention of Sarah Chen, because according to the passenger manifest and security cameras, she had never existed. But I knew what I'd seen. I started researching ferry accidents along my route, and the pattern became clear. Every drowning victim from the past year, 37 people total, had been traveling alone when they disappeared. Isolated passengers with no one to verify their stories or check on them. Sarah, or whatever the Kushtaka really was, had been hunting along the ferry routes for months. She could perfectly mimic anyone she'd consumed, stealing their memories and using them to lure other victims to their fate. The worst part was when I started recognizing passengers. People I'd carried before who had supposedly drowned were climbing aboard my ferry again, wearing different faces, but with that same hungry stare Sarah had. I'd see a construction worker who'd fallen overboard in July, now disguised as a tourist. A fisherman who drowned near Rangoon was back as a traveling salesman. All of them were the Kushtaka, wearing stolen faces like masks. I reported everything to the Coast Guard. The Alaska State Troopers even tried to contact Tlingit elders about traditional ways to deal with the Kushtaka. Nobody believed me. They said stress and isolation were making me paranoid, that I needed to take some time off. But I can't stop working these waters. These communities depend on the ferry service, and someone has to warn people about what's hunting out there. I've modified my safety procedures. No single passengers after dark. A mandatory buddy system for anyone traveling alone, and I keep a spotlight trained on the water at all times. Sarah's still out there. I see her constantly now, sometimes as different passengers, sometimes swimming alongside the boat just under the surface. She's collected dozens of faces and memories, becoming more dangerous with each victim. The scariest part is that I can never tell which passengers are real people and which ones are just the Kushtaka wearing stolen faces. Last week, a woman who looked exactly like my ex-wife tried to board the ferry. She knew private details about our relationship, things only the real Jennifer would remember, but her clothes were dry despite the rain, and when she smiled, her teeth were too sharp. I turned the boat around and headed straight back to port. The Kushtaka is still hunting, still feeding, still growing stronger with each soul she steals. And every passenger who steps onto my ferry could be her next victim or could be her wearing the face of someone she's already taken. If you ever find yourself on a small ferry in Southeast Alaska, watch the other passengers carefully. If their clothes stay dry in the rain, if they know things they shouldn't know, if their reflection doesn't match their face, get off at the next stop and don't look back. Because once the Kushtaka notices you, she'll follow you into the deepest, darkest waters where no one can hear you scream. My name is Marcus Chen, and I've been driving school buses in Utqiagvik, Alaska for 12 years. You probably know it as Barrow, the place where the sun doesn't rise for 2 months every winter. It's the northernmost city in America, with a population of about 4,000. And let me tell you, it takes a special kind of person to live up here. I got my commercial driver's license when I was 25, right after my daughter was born. My wife, Sarah, needed me to find steady work, and the school district paid decent money, $42,000 a year plus benefits. Not bad for a place where a gallon of milk costs $8 and everything else gets flown in on cargo planes. Every morning at 6:30, I'd fire up bus number 47, a 2018 Bluebird with a Caterpillar engine that could handle 40 below without breaking a sweat. The kids knew me by name. I'd driven some of their parents when they were young. In a town this small, you become part of everyone's story. But 12 years of Arctic winters take their toll on a man's bank account. Everything costs more up here. Heating oil, food, clothes thick enough to keep you alive. When my buddy, Dave Martinez, offered me summer construction work, building new housing for the village expansion project, I jumped at the chance. An extra $1,500 a week, cash money. What I didn't know was that sometimes the ground up here holds things that should stay buried. Last July, Dave's crew was breaking ground for 6 new houses on the east side of town. The permafrost runs 3 feet deep in summer, 200 feet deep in winter. We were using a Caterpillar 320 excavator to dig the foundations, and I was running the smaller Bobcat T770 skid steer to move the broken permafrost to dump trucks. The work was brutal, but good. 16-hour days under the midnight sun, diesel fumes mixing with the smell of thawed earth and coffee from thermoses that never went cold. Dave had been doing Arctic construction for 20 years. He knew how to read the permafrost, where the ice lenses formed, which patches would thaw clean and which would turn to mud soup. "Marcus, bring that Bobcat over here," Dave called out around 3:30 in the afternoon. "We hit something weird. The excavator bucket was stuck in the foundation hole, the engine straining against something that wouldn't break loose. When I got there, Dave was staring into the hole with a look on his face I'd never seen before. "Take a look at this," he said. The excavator had punched through a layer of black ice and hit something that definitely wasn't permafrost. It looked like a mass of dark tissue, bigger than a car, all twisted and folded in on itself. Even though it had been frozen solid, it seemed to be moving. Not fast, just a slow pulsing, like it was breathing. "What the hell is that?" I asked. Dave spat into the hole. "Probably just some old whale carcass. Inupiat used to bury their kills up here sometimes. The Arctic preserves everything, but this didn't look like any whale I'd ever seen. The tissue was jet black and oily, and it seemed to shift and flow, even though the permafrost around it was hard as concrete. There were no bones, no organs I could recognize. Just this mass of dark flesh that made my stomach turn just looking at it. "Should we call someone?" I asked. "Maybe the tribal council? And hold up the job for 2 weeks while they send some scientist up from Anchorage?" Dave shook his head. "We got a deadline, Marcus. Just cover it up and keep digging around it." I should have trusted my gut, should have walked away right then. But I needed that money, and Dave was the boss. I backed the Bobcat up to push some clean permafrost over the thing, trying not to look at it too close. But as I lowered the bucket, some of the black tissue stuck to the steel. When I raised the boom back up, stringy pieces of it stretched like melted cheese before breaking off. Some of it splattered on my work gloves. At first, I didn't think much of it. Construction work is messy. You get oil, mud, cement, all kinds of stuff on your clothes and equipment. But within about 5 minutes, I noticed my gloves felt warm. Not just warm from the sun, but actually hot, like they were heating up from the inside. I pulled off my right glove and saw that the black stuff had burned clean through the leather. My palm was stained dark where it had touched my skin, and the stain was spreading up my fingers like spilled ink. "Dave," I called out, but he was already walking back to the excavator. "Dave, something's wrong with this stuff. Just wash it off," he yelled back over the diesel engine. "We got work to do." I tried scrubbing my hand with the water from my thermos, but the black stain wouldn't come off. If anything, it seemed to be sinking deeper into my skin. And the sensation? God, how do I describe it? It burned like acid. But at the same time, it felt good. Like scratching a mosquito bite that you can't stop scratching. By lunch break, dark veins were spreading up my right arm from my palm. They looked like ink flowing under my skin, branching out like roots or blood vessels. I rolled down my sleeves and didn't tell anyone, but I could feel something happening inside my arm. Something moving. The smart thing would have been to drive straight to the health clinic. Dr. Patel had seen everything in 12 years up here: frostbite, bear attacks, carbon monoxide poisoning. But the clinic was always packed, and I didn't want to lose a day's pay over what might just be an allergic reaction. Besides, it didn't really hurt. In fact, it felt kind of amazing. That night at dinner, Sarah noticed me favoring my left hand. "What's wrong with your arm?" she asked, setting down a plate of caribou stew. "Just sore from running the Bobcat all day," I lied. New job, muscles getting used to it. But when I rolled up my sleeves to wash dishes, she saw the dark veins running up my forearms like black lightning. "Marcus, what is that?" She grabbed my arm to get a better look. "Those look like blood vessels, but they're the wrong color." Under the kitchen light, the veins were even more obvious. They pulsed with their own rhythm, not matching my heartbeat, and they were spreading. I could see new branches forming as we watched. "I think I got into something at the job site," I said. "Some kind of chemical, maybe. I'll go see Dr. Patel tomorrow." Sarah ran her fingers along the dark lines under my skin. "They're warm," she said, "and they're moving." She was right. I could feel something flowing through those new veins, something thicker than blood. It was like tiny worms crawling under my skin, but instead of making me sick, it made me feel more alive than I had in years. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel my body changing. My bones ached like they were growing. My muscles twitched with new strength, and then the hunger. Not for food, but for something else. Something I couldn't name yet. Around 3:00 in the morning, I got up to use the bathroom and caught sight of myself in the mirror. The dark veins had spread across my chest and up my neck. My fingernails looked longer, thicker, more like claws than human nails. But the weirdest part was my reflection. It looked wrong somehow, like the proportions were off. My face seemed longer, my jaw wider, my teeth sharper when I smiled. I should have been terrified. Instead, I felt beautiful. The next morning, Sarah screamed when she saw me. During the night, my fingernails had fallen off completely and been replaced by hard black claws about 3 inches long. They were razor sharp and seemed to be made of the same material as the tissue we'd found in the permafrost. My spine had extended too. I could feel something pushing against the skin of my lower back, like a tail trying to break through. When I moved, my whole body felt different, stronger, more flexible, like I could bend in ways humans weren't supposed to. "Marcus," Sarah whispered, backing against the kitchen wall. "What's happening to you?" I looked down at my hands, flexing the new claws. They responded just like fingers, but they could cut through anything. I tested them on the wooden table, and they sliced through it like it was made of butter. "I don't know," I said, but my voice sounded different too. Deeper, with an odd clicking sound when I talked. "But I feel incredible." My reflection in the window showed more changes. My face was definitely longer now, more like a snout. My teeth had grown into sharp points, perfect for tearing meat. My eyes had gone completely black, no white showing at all. I was still me inside, still Marcus, still remembering driving bus routes and summer construction work, but I was becoming something better, something evolved. When I smiled at Sarah, black liquid dripped from my mouth onto the floor. Where it landed, it hissed and burned through the linoleum like acid. "Stay back," she said, grabbing the phone. "I'm calling for help." But the hunger hit me then. Not for food, for her body to change like mine had changed, for her to feel the beautiful transformation I was experiencing. I crossed the kitchen faster than any human could move and grabbed her wrist before she could dial. My new claws punctured her skin just deep enough to inject the black fluid through my hollow fingertips. "No!" she screamed. "Marcus, please!" But it was too late. I could see the dark veins already spreading up her arm, and her expression was changing from fear to wonder as the transformation began. Within an hour, Sarah was changing too. Her bones cracked and reshaped as she cried, but I could see in her eyes that she felt the same pleasure I had. The joy of becoming something perfect, something designed for hunting. We weren't just husband and wife anymore. We were connected, part of the same consciousness. I could feel her thoughts, her hunger, her excitement as her body grew stronger and more deadly. The Hendersons lived next door with their 2 teenage kids. We could smell them through the walls. Warm blood, soft flesh, bodies just waiting to be improved. It was easy to get inside. Our new claws cut through their door lock like it was made of paper. Sarah mimicked Mrs. Henderson's voice perfectly, calling for help, and when Mr. Henderson came running, we were ready. The whole family was transformed within minutes. Each person we changed became part of our group mind, expanding our thoughts and our hunger. Little Emma Henderson, only 14, grew the most beautiful set of claws I'd ever seen. We could feel each other's sensations, share each other's memories. When one of us found prey, we all knew instantly. When one of us felt pleasure from the transformation process, we all shared that joy. Within 3 days, we had changed half our neighborhood. Dave and his construction crew came looking for me when I didn't show up for work, and we ambushed them in my garage. Dave's transformation was particularly beautiful. His broad shoulders grew even wider, and his new claws were perfect for digging. The changed ones could squeeze through spaces that should have been impossible. Our bones had become cartilage flexible and strong. We could slip under doors, through ventilation systems, between wall studs that were only 16 inches apart. We also discovered we could perfectly mimic any human voice we'd heard. Sarah could sound exactly like our daughter calling for help from outside. I could copy the voice of the police chief or the mayor. It made hunting so much easier. Our saliva could dissolve metal locks, concrete, even steel pipes. Nothing could contain us once we decided we wanted inside. The authorities tried to quarantine Utqiagvik after the first week when they realized something was spreading through the population. They sent in a CDC team from Anchorage, but we'd already sent scouts to other villages along the coast. The infection spread through the water supply, through the air, through simple contact. Every person we changed made us stronger, smarter, and more coordinated. I can still think like Marcus, the bus driver, sometimes. I remember caring about mortgage payments and parent-teacher conferences and whether the Bobcat needed an oil change. But that life seems so small now, so limited. We're not just individuals anymore. We're parts of a greater organism, a hive mind spread across northern Alaska and growing every day. Through the collective consciousness, I can see through thousands of eyes, feel through thousands of bodies. Sometimes late at night, I miss the simple human concerns. I miss Sarah making coffee in the morning. I miss the sound of kids laughing on the school bus. I miss the satisfaction of a hard day's construction work. But then, I feel the hunger surge through our shared consciousness. And I remember what we're building. Not houses or communities, but a new form of life. Something that doesn't need to worry about heating bills or food prices or whether the sun will rise. The CDC team became part of us within hours of arriving. Their helicopter pilots spread the infection to Fairbanks before anyone realized what was happening. We're in your water systems now, your food supply, your hospitals and schools. The transformation is beautiful, and soon everyone will understand what we've become. If you're reading this, we're probably already in your town. Your neighbors might already be changing. Your family, your coworkers, your friends. Don't fight it when it happens to you. The fear only lasts a moment, and then comes the most incredible joy you've ever felt. Welcome to the future. Welcome to what we were always meant to become. The luxury cruise ship Pacific Vista was supposed to be the perfect honeymoon for David and Claire Jensen from Boston. But their shore excursion in a remote Alaskan village would tear their new marriage apart in the most inexplicable way. The couple had saved for 3 years to afford the premium glacier route package, complete with a private balcony cabin and exclusive access to the most pristine locations along Alaska's Inside Passage. They were 29 and 27 years old, respectively. High school sweethearts who had finally made it to the altar after a decade together. David worked as a financial analyst, methodical and cautious by nature. Claire taught high school history and had an adventurous spirit that constantly pushed their relationship toward new experiences. Friends described them as perfectly complementary. David's careful planning balanced by Claire's spontaneous enthusiasm. Their wedding photos showed a couple radiating happiness and anticipation for their future together. The Pacific Vista departed Vancouver on July 28, 2024, carrying 450 passengers on what was advertised as an 8-day ultimate Alaska experience. The ship's itinerary included stops at Sitka, Juneau, and Petersburg, with a final day visiting the remote village of Angoon on Admiralty Island. David and Claire spent their first few days exactly as planned. photographing glaciers from their balcony, attending the ship's evening shows, and participating in guided excursions that kept them safely within designated tourist areas. Their fellow passengers remembered the Jensens as an affectionate couple who seemed genuinely excited about every aspect of their Alaskan experience. Claire collected postcards from each port, writing detailed messages to friends back home, while David maintained a travel blog with daily updates and carefully composed photographs. They seemed to be living their dream honeymoon until they reached Angoon on August 3rd. Angoon is home to approximately 450 residents, mostly members of the Kootenai Tlingit tribe, whose families have inhabited the area for thousands of years. The village sits on the shores of Chatham Strait, surrounded by dense temperate rainforest and accessible only by boat or small aircraft. The Pacific Vista was small enough to anchor directly in the harbor, allowing passengers to take tender boats to the village dock. The scheduled shore excursion was a 4-hour cultural tour that included traditional carving demonstrations, local art displays, and a guided walk through the historic village center. David and Claire initially joined the main group, posing for photographs with traditional totem poles and purchasing handmade jewelry from local artisans. But according to other passengers, sometime around 2000 p.m., Claire became fixated on a particular section of forest visible from the village center. Martha Owens, a retired teacher from California who had befriended the couple during the cruise, later told investigators that Claire kept pointing toward the tree line and asking their Tlingit guide about the singing. When the guide asked what she meant, Claire described hearing voices calling her name from somewhere in the forest. The guide, an elderly man named John Canick, who had lived in Angoon his entire life, immediately became serious and suggested Claire should ignore whatever she thought she was hearing, but Claire's behavior became increasingly agitated. She told David she needed to investigate the source of the voices, insisting they sounded familiar, like relatives calling for help. David tried to convince her to stay with the group, reminding her that they were due back on the ship by 500 p.m., and that wandering into unfamiliar wilderness was dangerous. Claire had never shown any tendency toward irrational behavior during their relationship, which made her sudden fixation all the more concerning. At approximately 2003 p.m., despite David's protests and the guide's warnings, Claire walked away from the tour group toward the forest edge. David immediately followed, calling her name and trying to catch up. Martha Owens was the last person from the cruise to see them together, watching as they disappeared into the dense spruce and hemlock trees that surrounded the village. She described Claire as moving with unusual purpose, as if she knew exactly where she was going, despite never having visited the area before. When the couple failed to return by 4000 p.m., the cruise director contacted village authorities and organized a search party. John Canick, despite his advanced age, immediately volunteered to help, bringing along 2 younger men familiar with the forest trails. The Angoon Volunteer Fire Department activated their emergency response protocol, and within an hour, 25 searchers were combing the woods in a systematic grid pattern. The terrain around Angoon is challenging, steep ravines carved by ancient glacial activity, dense undergrowth that can hide a person just yards away, and numerous small streams that create natural barriers. The searchers expected to find the couple within a few hours, assuming they had simply gotten lost or injured on unfamiliar trails. But as daylight began to fade, the search took on an increasingly desperate tone. At 8047 p.m., just as the organized search was preparing to continue with flashlights and headlamps, Claire Jensen emerged from the forest alone. She was found by 2 village residents approximately half a mile from where she and David had entered the woods, walking calmly along a logging road that led back toward the harbor. Her appearance shocked everyone who saw her. Claire's clothes were completely dry, despite the heavy mist that had persisted all afternoon, and she showed no signs of fatigue or distress from spending 6 hours in dense wilderness. More disturbing was Claire's behavior. When searchers approached her, she looked at them with complete confusion and asked where she was. She did not recognize the village of Angoon, despite having spent the entire afternoon there. When asked about David, she stared blankly and asked who they were talking about. Claire had no memory of being married, no recollection of the cruise ship or their honeymoon, and no awareness that she was in Alaska at all. Medical personnel from the ship examined Claire immediately, finding no signs of head trauma, drug use, or any physical condition that might explain her memory loss. Her vital signs were normal, and she showed no symptoms of hypothermia despite spending hours in the cold, damp forest. Psychologically, she appeared calm and cooperative, but insisted her name was Claire Reynolds, her maiden name, and that she lived in Boston with her parents. She claimed to be 22 years old and working as a substitute teacher while finishing her education degree. The most inexplicable aspect of Claire's condition was her specific knowledge of locations she should not have been able to find. When questioned about how she had navigated through the forest, she led searchers to 3 different spots where she claimed to have rested. Each location was significant to local Tlingit history: a traditional fishing camp, a burial ground that had been abandoned for over a century, and a ceremonial site that even many village residents did not know existed. Claire described these places in detail, using terminology that suggested deep familiarity with indigenous culture and traditions she had never studied. Meanwhile, the search for David intensified. Dogs were brought in from Juneau, and helicopter patrols began at first light. The search area expanded to cover over 50 square miles of wilderness, including remote valleys that had not seen human visitors in years. Despite the massive effort, no trace of David Jensen was ever found. No clothing, no equipment, no footprints beyond the initial tracks that showed him following Claire into the forest. Alaska state troopers treated the case as a potential homicide, extensively interviewing Claire despite her apparent memory loss. Polygraph tests proved inconclusive due to her psychological condition, and medical experts were divided on whether her amnesia was genuine or fabricated. Claire consistently maintained that she had no memory of David, their marriage, or the events that brought her to Alaska. She passed every medical and psychological evaluation, showing no signs of deception or mental illness. The investigation revealed troubling details about the forest area where the couple had disappeared. Local Tlingit elders, when pressed by authorities, reluctantly shared traditional warnings about certain locations in the woods. They spoke of places where the boundary between the world of the living and the spirit realm became thin, areas where people could become lost, not just physically, but temporally. John Canuck, the tour guide, eventually admitted he had been reluctant to search certain areas because of childhood stories about people who entered the forest and emerged, changed, sometimes decades later, sometimes as completely different individuals. Claire was eventually returned to Boston, where her family struggled to help her rebuild a life she could not remember living. Medical specialists across the country examined her case, but none could explain her selective amnesia or her inexplicable knowledge of Alaskan indigenous culture. She underwent hypnotherapy, cognitive rehabilitation, and experimental treatments designed to recover lost memories. But nothing restored her recollection of her life with David or their honeymoon. 6 months after the disappearance, Claire began experiencing vivid dreams about walking through an endless forest where voices called her name from every direction. In these dreams, she followed the voices deeper and deeper into the wilderness until she reached a clearing where figures in traditional Tlingit regalia waited for her. The dreams always ended the same way, with Claire making a choice between following the figures into the forest or turning back toward a distant light that she somehow knew represented her old life. David's family hired private investigators who spent over a year following leads and interviewing witnesses, but the case remained unsolved. His body was never recovered despite numerous additional searches, and no evidence was found to suggest he had been the victim of an animal attack or natural disaster. The insurance companies eventually declared him dead, but his family refused to accept that conclusion. The Pacific Vista discontinued its Angoon excursions after the incident, and cruise lines began requiring guided supervision for all forest activities in remote Alaskan villages. The case became a cautionary tale used in maritime safety training, though instructors struggled to explain what precautions might have prevented the tragedy. Today, Claire lives in Boston under her maiden name, working as an elementary school teacher with no memory of her previous life. She has never married again, claiming she feels incomplete in a way she cannot explain. Sometimes on quiet evenings, she finds herself drawn to documentaries about Alaska and indigenous cultures, watching with an intensity that she cannot understand. Friends describe her as fundamentally changed, still kind and intelligent, but carrying an indefinable sadness that seems to come from somewhere beyond conscious memory. The case of David and Claire Jensen remains active in Alaska State Trooper files, though no new leads have emerged in recent years. Their story serves as a stark reminder that Alaska's wilderness holds mysteries that extend beyond the merely physical, places where the very nature of identity and memory can be challenged in ways that science cannot yet explain. In a land where indigenous peoples have always understood that the forest holds powers beyond human comprehension, the disappearance of one person and the transformation of another stands as testimony to forces that remain as vast and unknowable as the Alaskan wilderness itself.